Far beyond the edge of town stood a dilapidated used car lot. It was a putrid boneyard of rust and decaying rubber. Normally, I wouldn't set foot in a place like that, but I was desperate. It was either get a car or spend the rest of the semester taking public transit. And that made me want to vomit. All of the cars were junk, hollowed out shells, all except one, a red sports car, in pretty good condition, and, more importantly, 50% off. I entered the musty sales shack to buy it. I could see the sweat oozing out of the salesman's disgusting pores as I perused the paperwork. He could barely keep his composure, as if he was privy to some joke I knew nothing about. And when I finally signed the sales contract, he laughed maniacally. Must have been overjoyed at that sales commission. The first few weeks with the car were a dream, but it was about to become a nightmare. In a pitch-black parking lot, I approached the car, and from the darkness beyond, I could hear the sounds of people having intercourse. They sounded more like crazed animals than civilized human beings. I ran to the car, lest I get caught up in some depraved orgy. The next day I approached the car again, and again I heard the same wild, frantic sounds. But this was in the middle of the daytime. Were people having orgies in the middle of the day now? No. These noises were coming from the car. How could I have been so stupid? The car was obviously cursed. That's why it was such a bargain. I couldn't sleep for days, tossing and turning, ruminating about what I was going to do next, and then suddenly, the noises stopped. Weeks passed without incident. Then a crack of lightning struck a man dead. It was my friend's grandfather, and he demanded I go to the funeral of someone I barely knew. After almost dying of awkwardness no less than 10 times, I went back to the car, and my heart sunk. The noises had returned. The raucous slapping of flesh on flesh was even louder this time. Savage screams echoed on the aluminum siding of the funeral home. I furtively dashed towards the car, hoping that nobody would identify it as my car. But out of the corner of my eye, I could see Grandma glaring at me. The next day I got a phone call, and I recognized that withered old voice. It was Grandma. She said, "Look, I don't care what you do in your free time, but don't bring a prostitute to my husband's funeral." That knocked the wind out of me. She had correctly associated that barbaric screeching with me. I was mortified, and I tried to explain the situation, but I could barely get a word out and only managed to mutter something about promising to never bring a prostitute to her funeral. This car was going to ruin my life. No mechanic would look at it. As soon as I mentioned the lustful shrieking, the pandemonium of genitals thrusting this way and that, they'd hang up the phone in terror. My only option was to take it back to the dealer and demand a full refund. The salesman's spittle covered me from head to toe as he bellowed, laughing even harder this time. He told me young lovers had been murdered while making love in the car. And now it was haunted, he cackled, by a ghost shoving his erect penis into another ghost for eternity. Well, that explained the sounds. "Maybe you could sell it to some other sap," he said, "if you've got the stomach for it." I retorted, maybe I could sue you for selling me a car that people were murdered in. Surely the consumer had some recourse in situations like this. The salesman laughed so hard he was doubled over, and then he died right there on the spot. So much for that. I spent many sleepless nights thinking about what he said. Sell it to some other sap. But I didn't have the stomach to make someone else suffer as I had. So I went back to the graveyard where my friend's grandfather was buried, shovel in hand. After 5 hours of sweating under the cold moon, I dragged the corpse out from its resting place and heaved it onto the back seat of my car. My plan worked perfectly. The noises never returned. Because if there's one thing I know for sure, it's impossible to maintain an erection when Grandpa is there.